talk a bit more about where in the regulation selection is being anchored and where selection procedures and criteria are being anchored. But of course, I don't want to, I think the workshop itself should not become too legal as such. I think it's just to give you more the framework within which we are operating, and then really looking what kind of are the best processes, the best methods, and which is the flexibility you also have to apply it as much as possible, tailor-made to your program. If I can have the first slides. Yeah, so as I said to, I think there was a slide in between, but okay, let's continue with that. Just to say that, to repeat once more what I said also during the question and answers, that there are different ways of selecting projects, and that this workshop really focuses on the competitive mode of selecting projects, so call for applications. The most important thing is only to remind you that irrespective of which mode of selection of projects, that the general criteria apply, like non-discriminatory, inclusive and transparent, that the operation selected should maximize the contribution of the union funding, and that they also should be in line with the horizontal principles. So those elements apply to any project, irrespective if it's been selected in a competitive mode or more in a non-competitive mode. Next to that, it's also important that the projects need to be adapted to the selection of the operations, to the interactive specificities, so to the different strands. Of course, when you talk about transnational programs, you have different type of projects you generally support them, for example, in the cross-border context. So obviously, you need to adapt the selection procedures according to that. The same for the types of territories. When you speak about land borders, for example, or maritime borders, different elements play a role and they should be taken into account. Last but not least, also the maturity of the cooperation. When you think about, as we always talk about, the first layer of a cross-border program is trust building, then programs with a longer history on cross-border cooperation or on cooperation probably have to invest more in this type of projects, whereas programs which have already a long history of cooperation, that's less important. Although trust building always remains important. Then what are the main key elements in the legislation you can find back both in the CPR regulation and in the Interreg regulation, which play a role for the selection of operations and which are relevant to keep in mind? Well, first of all, the selection of the operation should be simple and clear. So we should avoid gold plating. That's easier said than done. We always realize this, and of course also the Commission sometimes adds to the administrative burden, but we should still try from all partners involved to keep it as simple, as clear as possible. The compliance with the horizontal principles is something which is anchored in the CPR regulation and therefore also applicable to the Interreg programs. Well, I will not go too much in detail on this because we had the workshop already in December on the horizontal principles, but it's something that all the projects which we support should be compliant with those horizontal principles, like the Charter on Fundamental Rights, gender equality, non-discrimination, the Sustainable Development Goals from the UN, and also the Do Not Significant Harm principle. Obviously, especially for infrastructure projects, but not only, they should be in line, full respect of the environmental acquis. And the monitoring committees and the steering committee should apply the partnership principle as set out in Article 8. And of course, this is, I would say, even more relevant for the Interreg programs than for the mainstream programs, since the monitoring committees select the projects, which is not the case, of course, for the mainstream programs, which means that the composition should reflect the partnership, national, regional, local authorities, representatives of the business sector, non-governmental organizations, depending on the type of specific objectives you have chosen and policy objectives you have chosen. Next slide, please. Well, then more about the selection process as such. Well, the key article in the regulation, in the Interreg regulation, is Article 22. Where in principle all the basic elements which have to be respected are summarized. And well, I go through them very quickly. Well, obviously the selection process should be in line with the program strategy and the objectives chosen. The role of the monitoring committee and the steering committee I already mentioned, and especially, of course, you can have steering committees responsible for sub-programs within the program. especially, for example, for those programs which have selected policy objective 5, Europe closer to citizen. And an important element, of course, a new element compared to the previous program period, is that there's more flexibility, of course, now to support projects with beneficiaries outside the program area. So there's not anymore a limitation or a ceiling, but they need to get the explicit approval by the managing authority and to be expressed in the monitoring committee and the steering committee. And indicating what is the impact of the project, why it's important to be supported, and the impact of the project on the program area as such. So what is the cooperation element, for example. Next slide. I already mentioned the basic principles which apply to any selection mode, irrespective if it's competitive mode or non-competitive mode. So they are mentioned here again: non-discriminatory, transparent, ensuring accessibility also to persons with disabilities, gender equality, and the Charter of Fundamental Rights, Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, and the policy on environment. As we heard from the Court of Auditors, one of their main findings was the lack of ranking in quite a few programs of the operations which were proposed for selection. And this prioritization of operations is also something which you can find back in Article 22. So the use of a ranking system. And this is something I think compared to there's clearly a scope for further improvement, I would say, for some of the programs. And of course, especially in this context, it's important to look at the cooperation dimension of the operations. And from our point of view, the cooperation dimension is not a priority criterion, it's a precondition. It's a precondition, it's a condition for the selection of projects. So it's certainly not something, well, any project supported under the Interreg programs needs to have a clear cooperation dimension. Otherwise, it should not be supported by an Interreg program or maybe by a mainstream program. And also mentioned in this Article 22 is that at the request of the Commission, we can ask you to notify to the Commission prior to us the initial selection criteria for our assessment. Well, we keep up this flexibility. We're certainly not going to do this in principle for all programs, but certainly for programs where we of a larger size, programs where we see certain difficulties, or where we had some issues during the negotiations, we certainly want to be informed about these selection criteria upfront, so that we can make also our observations. But this is a kind of an option which we have in the regulation, and we will use it where appropriate and where necessary. Next slide. Well, the process, about the process, and which is also mentioned in Article 22, the main elements. Well, again, I don't think we have very surprising texts, or texts which are very new, which I think you're already very familiar with. Well, first of all, the projects need to have an effective, need to provide an effective contribution to the achievement of its specific objectives. So here we will certainly look at the contribution to the key indicators and the targets set in the program. So to build a clear link between the operation as such to be supported and what is written in the program for the objectives to be achieved. The operation should not be conflict with the corresponding strategies. So here we speak mainly about the programs on the external borders. So especially for the multi-annual strategies for the NDICI and the IPA programs. They should be in line with those multi-annual strategies. Well, they should present the best relationship between the amount of support and the activities undertaken and the achievement of the objectives. But in one simple word, the budget should be proportionate to what the operation tries to achieve and contributes to the program. So appropriate and proportionality are the keywords here. And finally, the beneficiary of the operation to be supported should have the necessary financial resources and the mechanisms to cover operations. So which means the administrative and the financial capacity to not only to implement the project, but also to maintain the project for cost for operation. As you know, we do not support operational costs, so in principle that should be guaranteed. Here, maybe one important message, which from our point of view, what we sometimes see that programs also include as a selection criteria the experience with the Interact funds, and that's for us is not the same as what is mentioned here, because we would like to see that also new beneficiaries have the possibility to apply for funding, so that the managing authority and joint secretariats reach out to those potential new beneficiaries, and that doesn't stay as a kind of inner circle of the same type of beneficiaries we see program period after program period again. And certainly they're not excluded, and we still want to see them as important beneficiaries of projects, but we think it's also important to reach out to new beneficiaries, certainly also when new topics are being covered in the program. And that we believe, and we also convinced that that also broadens the basis under the program and also the support for the program once you also involve more potential beneficiaries. Next slide. Yeah, then the projects, again, I think the ones which have a clear infrastructure elements or have an impact on the environment, they need to be in line with the either to be subject to an environmental impact assessment or screening where it's applicable. Also that the applicable law has been complied with, especially for operations which have started before the submission of an application. Operations, of course, should fall within the scope of the Interact fund concerned, and that can be, for example, checked if they are clearly attributable to a type of intervention code. And also operations should not be supported which were part of an operation which is subject to a relocation or transfer of a productive activity. So I don't think, to be frank, we will not find many of those projects within Interact programs, but still important to remember. Then also important operations which are directly affected by a reasoned opinion by the Commission or in respect of an infringement should in principle not be supported. And also for investments in infrastructure with an expected lifespan of at least 5 years, you have to make an assessment of the expected impacts on the climate change. These are, I think, are all relatively more technical requirements which do not in principle apply to each individual operation, but where applicable and where relevant, they should be followed up. Next slide, please. Yeah, well, this is the horizontal principles which we discussed extensively, I think, at the workshop at the beginning of December last year. So I will not go more in detail in this, but within the program, it's important to make a reference to them in section 1.2 in the more general part, or in section 2.1.2 when it's more about specific actions where they are relevant. So it's something which should be included within the program, but also throughout the whole program life cycle. So also during the implementation phase, and well, all the operations which are going to be supported should be compliant with those horizontal principles. In the next slide, you will see them once more in summary. So the EU Charter on Fundamental Rights, gender equality, non-discrimination, including accessibility, and sustainable development. And said before, we prepared an extensive summary and follow-up document of the seminar in December, so I don't think we have to go in detail at this moment. But if there are any questions, of course, we can answer them. And then my last slides. I just want to inform you that our colleagues here in DG REGIO, which are working on administrative capacity, they are doing a study which should be finished relatively soon, by September of this year, on selection of operations. It has 3 main elements. Well, first of all, stock taking of good examples, procedures, and criteria which are used for selection, which should be summarized then in a handbook, which will be available for everybody, and should be really a handbook of practices. So hopefully a very useful practical tool also for you. And then we should also will present the results of this study to in wider circles. So there will be further communication on once this handbook is available, also to you, and also information seminars will be organized about this. The study is based on a sample of 30 programs, of which 3 Interact programs are covered: the transnational program Alpine Space, the cross-border program Belgium, Flanders, Netherlands, and the IPA program Romania, Serbia. So also Interreg specific characteristics should be in principle also be taken into account in this study and also then in the handbook. And hopefully, as I said before, it will be a useful tool for all of us to improve further the scope of the selection procedures and the selection criteria. So that's everything a little bit on the framework, the legal framework within which we operate, and which you can find back in the regulation. So the basic article is Article 22 of the ETC regulation. But once again, within that framework, we should look for the best solutions, the most effective and efficient solutions, which are tailor-made for the needs of each individual program. Thank you very much for your attention.